To begin with, we'll go over, just the title of the presentation. Um, that being, why is education a privilege and not a right? A comprehensive look into state disinvestment and the achievement gap for underrepresented communities all across our campuses and statewide. Um, this, sorry, this teaching will, and in this teaching we will discuss the inequitable outcomes in our education system for students of color, LGBTQ students, and low-income students, how the high cost of higher education diminishes social mobility for marginalized communities, as well as a brief history of why Oregon slashed funding to its public institutions, and then finally, we'll discuss the dismantling of the statewide university system and what you can do about it. And then we'll go off to Gabby to explain that next slide.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Victor. And I do want to note that the next few slides I'm going to go through is a lot of graphs and charts. So Andrew is the moderator today, and if there is any questions that come up while I'm going through this information, feel free to throw that question in the chat or raise your hand so that you can ask the question like through the call. And then we will try to either address them during the slide, or at the end we have a full Q&A dedicated to this as well. So first I wanted to start off with measuring Oregon against 40-40-20. And it's important to talk about what 40-40-20 is. So Oregon has an ambitious goal to have a fully educated workforce by 2025. And so 40-40-20 basically represents 40% of folks having a bachelor's or advanced degree, 40% having an associate's degree or certificate, and then the remaining 20% having at least high school completion. Now, as we can see right here, Oregon's pretty far from its goal. And in terms of the educated workforce for Oregon in 2013, when they did a survey, we definitely see that there is 10% of the overall population that still has less than high school completion, and a pretty large majority of high school completion. But when we also look at this, we want to take into account the racial dynamics here. And so as we can see here, the overall Oregon population only has about 10% of the high school less than completion rate. But when we look at selected racial identities and groups, that jumps up to 32%. So as we can see, there definitely is disparities in education and access for communities of color to have an access to higher education. And so this next chart right here is data taken from ACLU on a survey they did in 2008, 2009. And so we can see here that we really need to start the conversation through K through 12 education and see how that connects to access in higher education. And so the important numbers that I really want to show right here is that the out-of-school suspension rates for specific racial categories. And so as we can see here, the share of the student body made up about 68.42% of the overall student body and 64.86% of the out-of-school suspensions that were happening in K through 12 education. But when we look at like Black individuals, for example, we can see that the overall share of the student body is 2.94%. However, the out-of-school suspension is 7.37%, which is more than double the overall attendance of Black individuals attending K through 12 education. So as we can see here, there's definitely a really disproportionate rate of reprimanding and school punity that goes against communities of color in K through 12 education. Now, this is also an access issue in terms of completion. And so when people are trying to complete their degree, obviously this creates a barrier for that as well. And so the next chart here looks at the rate of dropouts within each racial demographic that was surveyed here. And so as we can see here, the share of the student body for white individuals was 73.2%. However, the dropout rate is 59.3%. But then when we look at other racial demographics, we can see that the dropout rate increases to, once again, over the overall share of the student body. And so if Oregon wants to get to its 40-40-20 goal, we really need to start going back to the access and education and making sure that all communities do have an accessible education for completion. And if Oregon's not addressing its racial achievement gap in K through 12 education, then the 40-40-20 goal becomes a lot less dimming in reaching it by 2025, which Oregon, as we already saw, is pretty far from that. And OSA has worked on things like K through 12 ethnic studies bills in 2017 that we worked to pass, which is also really important in terms of making sure that the education is comprehensive and culturally competent, but we still have a pretty far way to go.
Thank you. And then going off to the point about retention, retention issues are also seen for LGBTQ students as well. This data, as you can see in the chart right there, was collected by GLSEN survey in 2013 that shows that nearly 1 in 5 LGBTQ students cited frequent absences and needing extended breaks from school. And a disproportionate amount of LGBT and trans students had concealed their own sexualization and or gender identity for fear of personal safety, bullying, rejection, um, and yeah, and staying in school with these constant barriers makes completion of their education all the more difficult. For Oregon to be more fiscally responsible, it will need to address these barriers amongst the LGBTQ plus community. So as we can see in the right hand side of the chart, um, heterosexuals cite that most frequently that no, they don't um, conceal their sexual orientation or gender identity. But then we go to the LGB middle part of that chart, um, and kind of half and half saying no and yes, and then going off to the left side hand or right side, my bad, for students who identify as transgender who do in fact most of the time conceal their gender identity. Thank you. And then going to kind of understanding the amount of funds that go into each degree that students go for. Education is important and helps people earn more income over their lifetime, as we can see in the charts. It also reduces the overall rate of unemployment. We can see the earning from a high school diploma to a bachelor degree increases the average earning by almost $459. So as you can see, for someone on that blue side of the chart, for someone who gets their high school diploma, their median usual weekly earning is $678. And then for like myself, who is getting a bachelor's degree, that almost doubles and is at 1,137. And then on that right hand side of the chart, the green part, we can see that the unemployment rate is much higher for those who have no diploma and just a high school diploma. So we can definitely see that discrepancy there. Um, and then moving on, um, attaining a degree obviously is therefore becomes a privilege that ends up costing Oregon a lot. As Oregon relies heavily on income tax to generate revenue, education is beneficial to the individual and the state. On average, college students make up $650,000 more in their lifetime than a high school diploma alone. This represents 210,000, my bad, dollars in tax revenue per student, or approximately 503 million dollars lost in state revenue per year. Um, and that puts the racial achievement gap, um, which then cost Oregon approximately 2.5 billion a year in lost revenues. Um, and then off to Andrew to explain kind of the history of the funding for Oregon is the way it is now.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, so we've kind of seen how a lot of factors contribute to an achievement gap, specifically for marginalized communities, right? And we know that there's definitely historical and institutional and cultural reasons for the lack of access for marginalized communities. And then we also see how this kind of becomes a social justice issue and an economic justice issue, right? So we've seen that access to higher levels of institutional degrees and higher levels of education institutional systems are really important for socioeconomic outcomes and mobility. And so we really want to go back and talk a little bit about the history of how we got to the point where these institutions are so difficult to access on a financial level as well, right? So important moment in Oregon's history is ballot measure 5. This was a ballot measure that was passed in 1990. Could I just see could you all throw in the chat actually, so I can get a sense of our familiarity with this, like just like yes or no, like who all's heard of ballot measure 5? Seeing some yeses, seeing some no's, seeing some thumbs ups. All right, cool. So pretty good array. So basically ballot measure 5 was written by anti-tax activists Bill Sizemore and Don McIntyre. There's a picture here we can see. And they would go on to found organizations that became associated with what was known in the 90s as the Oregon Tax Revolt. Which was a movement to kind of limit taxes, especially for businesses and wealthy individuals in Oregon. And it was actually financially backed by out-of-state interests by a nationwide group called Americans for Tax Reform, which was a fiscally conservative advocacy group with financial backing from large corporations and associations from the pharmaceutical industry, the tobacco industry, and the oil and natural gas industry. And so ballot measure 5 was actually the beginning of a series of ballot measures in Oregon that started really changing our tax code in Oregon and really dwindling the amount of money the state had for public infrastructure and social safety nets, including for education. So ballot measure 5 basically put a cap on local property taxes. And it was very contentious at the time. For instance, we also see a photo here of students marching against it. These are college students from OSU. And we're going to talk about why it was that students were concerned about this. So if we go to the next slide, first of all, we want to realize that up until 1990, K through 12 education in Oregon was largely funded by local property taxes. So this chart compares the breakdown of the main revenue sources for K through 12 education in 1990, and then in 2011, about a decade after ballot measure 5. So as we see, local property taxes were the main source up until 1990, and then we shifted to more state funding. And so that really put a big burden on the state because the state did not have enough revenue to fully fund both the K through 12 education and the higher education system. So what happened was, since a lot of voters tend to be, the demographics that turn out the most to vote tend to be of an age and a lifestyle where they are parents of students in K through 12 education, there was much more of a political impetus on Oregon legislators to prioritize funding for K through 12, which is certainly an important thing to fund, but less impetus on funding higher education, right? So if we go to the next chart, we can see what the outcome was on this shift for colleges. So first we're going to talk about universities. Public universities in Oregon have traditionally been their primary source of revenue was state funding from the state of Oregon. But as we see with ballot measure 5, state funding diminished more and more. And so tuition, the other source of revenue, became more and more of the biggest bulk of funding for our public universities, right? And so we look at this chart and it compares increases in average tuitions across Oregon public four-year universities with just the CPI adjusted rate, meaning how much tuition would go up for just inflation, right? And we see that there's a pretty significant change once we get to 90 and ballot measure 5 passing. All of a sudden, tuition rates start increasing astronomically and really outpacing the increase of tuition. And then a similar problem was happening for community colleges, right? So this chart shows the 3 main revenue sources of community colleges over the late 2000s or like the late 2010 area. And what we see is the main 3 sources of revenue for community colleges were traditionally local property taxes, which ballot measure 5 really capped and limited, state funding, and tuition. And what we see is property taxes are the line where it's the smallest amount contributed. And we see over the years it crept up to the point where even community colleges, which were supposed to be an affordable option, were also primarily reliant on tuition revenues to be able to operate.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Andrew. And on the note of community colleges, it's really important to talk about community colleges because they are a critical place to keep an educated workforce in Oregon. Now, especially with the career and technical education or CTE programs, community colleges often serve really important job sectors in Oregon, like nursing, the automotive industry, cybersecurity, the list goes on. And so community colleges are really important to make sure that we can keep an educated workforce in Oregon. They're also really efficient, right? So they're traditionally about 2-year or less programs than a traditional 4-year degree. And so they're often more accessible in terms of time and completion of the degree, and also in terms of cost usually. So they are usually traditionally more affordable options so that people can have their first entrance into post-secondary education through these institutions. Now, unfortunately, with the divestments that Andrew was looking at, we need to talk about AAOTs and ASOTs, which are 2-year programs that essentially are general education requirements that are fulfilled at the community college before people transfer to universities to finish a 4-year degree. And AAOTs and ASOTs are looked at as cost positive, which means that when the colleges are balancing their budgets, they generate revenue. Now, career and technical education programs, they're often looked at as cost negative, which means that it takes extra funding to make sure that the programs can be up and running, which we know they're very important. But since the huge disinvestments in education are happening, this leads institutions to prioritize and incentivize themselves to prioritize transfer degree initiatives and incentives, which often cut or stagnate really important CTE programs that are meant to keep a really viable and educated workforce in Oregon.
Thank you, Gabby. Um, as you can see in the chart right now, the cost for community colleges also poses a big issue, making the traditionally affordable option more difficult to afford. In the 2014-15 LCC school year, the most expensive community college in Oregon, the cost for a full-time enrollment was $4,920 for 3 school terms. For those who qualified for the full opportunity Oregon Opportunity Grant and the full federal Pell Grant, this meant that there was an additional $2,725 that students were left with for costs such as rent, textbooks, groceries, and all that. So that's on that left hand side where we can see that there's a surplus in the amount that they were given to again use for rent or textbooks. And then on the right side for the 2019-2020 LCC school year, the cost is $10,845 for full-time enrollment for 3 terms. And even if a student had the full Oregon Opportunity Grant and the federal Pell Grant, students still owe $1,722 out of pocket. Versus when it was 2014, they were left with that surplus. This shows that the state and federal aid has not kept up with community college costs, which is what used to make them great. a great option because it's a cost-effective alternative to going to a four-year institution. And this is something I can speak on kind of like I relate to this a lot because although I go to PSU and I do get the full Oregon Opportunity Grant and the full federal Pell Grant, I'm still having to take out loans because the aid that the state gives and that the federal government gives is just still not enough. And that's a cost we'll see later on when you have to either defer loans or have to be paying those out once you graduate.
Thanks, Victor. So as we've seen, not only is tuition and the cost of attendance going up because of lack of support from the state, but we've also seen not enough support from the state to access financial aid programs, which are helping us attend these schools, right? And so I had previously spoken a little bit about the beginning of the Oregon tax revolt. And this is actually something that is a dynamic that has played out in Oregon ever since then. And so we see time and time again, not enough funding of higher education and financial aid programs. And part of that is because Oregon as a state really struggles to have the resources it needs to fully fund everything to the amount that there is a need. And part of that is this continued history of kind of chipping away at the amount of tax revenues that the state of Oregon is bringing in. So this chart we're looking at right now is from the Oregon Center for Public Policy. It's based on a study that was done in 2015. And it's basically analyzing since 1975 corporate income tax contributions as a share of the economy. And it found that they declined over that time span by 56%. So by the 2013 and 15 budget period, corporate income taxes were just 0.27% of Oregon gross state product. So in fact, Oregon is actually frequently stated in studies as having one of the lowest business tax burdens in the entire nation. So state funding is actually pretty difficult to obtain in general because our state's budget is really not getting all the resources it needs and is not getting them in a stable way. The state of Oregon is largely dependent on personal income taxes, which, as we know, the amount of revenue we're going to be able to generate through personal income taxes is really going to vary with the amount of income that individuals are making. And then also on the Oregon Lottery Fund, which is a fund that is brought in through the Oregon Lottery, which we know through studies is largely paid into by low-income individuals. Another important moment to highlight is the end of the Oregon University system in 2015. So this is a pretty recent thing. It was just 5 years ago. But another dynamic we saw at play is as state divestment started happening, there was more and more pressure on institutions to find outside and private sources of funding. And so we saw the rise of a lot of partnerships with corporations, especially starting with University of Oregon. And we're going to kind of go into some things that happened at University of Oregon because we see that the history of how that played out actually ended up impacting every public university across the state of Oregon. So just to kind of give you an idea of what it means for the Oregon university system to end, if we go to the next slide, this is the old model that existed before 2015. There was a public coordinated system of higher education in Oregon. And as we see here, they're all technically under the governor and the executive branch. But we saw that, there's community colleges that already had their own local boards. There was other state agencies involved. One of them is the Oregon Office of Student Access and Completion. And then there was an Oregon University system that kind of coordinated the missions and operations of all the institutions in Oregon. And one of the things they did was coordinate kind of what degree programs were offered at different institutions and made sure state resources were going efficiently, right? So this campus, would specialize in engineering and that campus would specialize in something else. And they also had a lot of regulation over the budgetary decisions and the tuition prices at these institutions. And I'm seeing a hand raised. So Nick, did you have a question?
Yeah, so under the Oregon University system, did they have the board of trustees like structure? Like, did those exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what Nick's referring to is right now, every public university has a board of trustees. And was that there in the old model under Oregon University system? And the answer is no. And we're actually going to see that when we go to the next chart. The board of trustees was created specifically for this new model as an alternative to a more coordinated statewide system for governance. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions? I know we're like throwing a lot of like charts and info at everyone, so. Cool, all right. Well, we'll then kind of go off that and look at the new model then. The new model is basically that, sure, there's the governor of Oregon, there's the Department of Education, there's a state agency called the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and they oversee some things, including the Office of Student Access and Completion still exists. But then there's also, we kind of have like looser tied lines here because there's very limited regulatory authority that the HEC has over institutions. And like Nick brought up, institutions now have their own institutional boards. Depending on the campus, who that is varies on the institutional board, but oftentimes it's alumni, and oftentimes it's alumni who have been pretty successful themselves economically and have been major donors for the institutions, as we're going to dig into a little bit later. And these institutional boards have the oversight of the president of the institution. The president of the institution oftentimes then makes recommendations to the governor, who appoints the board members. So there's this interesting dynamic where the president of an institution is immediately accountable to the institutional board, which has limited oversight from the HEC or from the state of Oregon in general, except a few things that Oregon Student Association and other partners have been able to really like advocate for and push for in this transition. But we kind of see in this new model that these board of trustees that we're aware of are really a new thing that came to be in 2015. So if we go to the next slide, I kind of want to situate historically what happened in leading up to that. So this all started based on that kind of increased reliance on corporate and private partnerships that public universities were going through as a result of state divestment, right? So this idea started with individuals at the University of Oregon. The University of Oregon has a lot of philanthropic donations, specifically from Phil Knight, and a lot of partnerships with Nike, which is the company that Phil Knight founded. And in 2011, President Richard LaRiviere, as well as former President Dave Frohnmeyer, introduced this idea. It was called the New Partnership. And this was part of a nationwide trend of decentralizing things. There was actually in the same year basically the same idea introduced in Wisconsin, and that was called the New Badger Partnership. And there was a political action committee formed called Oregonians for Higher Education Excellence. They argued that kind of decentralizing the system and giving more autonomy to institutions would give them more autonomy to do private fundraising and therefore have more money to keep tuition down. And at the time, Oregon Student Association and labor unions representing workers in higher education, classified staff, as well as faculty, opposed this idea and said that it was a move towards privatization of our public institutions. So here we have an example of some of the individuals who gave money to Oregonians for Higher Education Excellence in support of this proposal. There's Nike founder Phil Knight, Tim Boyle, who's the CEO of Columbia Sportswear, Chuck Lillis, who at the time was the CEO and chairman of Media One, which was later sold to AT&T, and is actually currently a board of trustees member at the U of O. And they each gave about $65,000 to this political action committee, and there was other contributors too. A big other presence in the Capitol building in Salem in favor of this proposal, which once again students and organized labor were against, was the Oregon Business Association. They are now known as Oregon Business and Industry after a 2017 merger, and they're essentially like an advocacy group for businesses in Oregon local businesses as well as like larger multinational corporations and nationwide businesses that do business in Oregon. So on their steering committee and governing board are corporations such as Bank of America, Nike, and Intel. So this played out. This played out over the course of several years, where there was a few attempts to pass the legislation and some controversy around it. And ultimately it was passed, and Portland State University and University of Oregon were the first two institutions to break away and make their own local board. And by 2015, every public university in Oregon had broken away, and the Oregon University system was essentially over. Got some comments. Makes me think these businesses and individuals didn't consider how community colleges would be adversely affected. Yeah, thanks for that comment, Madeline. Yeah, I mean, it was definitely something that played out and was interesting, that a lot of the entities that oftentimes are pushing to decrease state spending so that there's more kind of caps and checks on how much taxes are being paid in the state, especially by business operations. We're supporters of this. And it's an interesting thing because I think definitely a lot of these businesses do want to make sure that the state of Oregon is making sure that there's a population of workers who have the degrees and skills to contribute to their companies. But definitely it was a moment where kind of these more private interests very much clashed and didn't agree with the students and the workers at these institutions. And it ended up that they were the ones that won out on that policy debate. And then if we go on to the next slide, this is just kind of a chart looking at annual tuition and fees for full-time students in Oregon public four-year universities. You see some highlighting on this residential tuition and fees. And basically, Oregon Student Association and Labor had said that looking at this nationwide trend, when a state university system was decentralized or deregulated, tuition went up. It didn't go down, it went up. And we've seen that play out because even if institutions have more freedom to do private fundraising, oftentimes private fundraising major gifts are not going to general operating budgets in a way that can keep tuition down. They're oftentimes going to projects. I don't know if on your individual campuses you see a lot of fancy newfangled buildings with names of donors on them. But that kind of thing, right? Capital construction projects or making, certain programs that are then better resourced, right? But not actually a lot of that money has ended up going to keeping tuition down itself. So this is a comparison in just the 5 years since the end of the Oregon University system. This is pretty new, right? So we don't have great data yet. It's still pretty recent, but in the 5 years since the end of the Oregon University system, if we compare the tuition increase, it's been about an 18.15% increase. And this once again is kind of adjusted for inflation based on what's adjusted for inflation in 2019 dollars. And if we just want to compare that 18.15% increase over a 5-year span, how does that compare to before the end of the Oregon University system? The last 5 years of the Oregon University system, 2011 to 2016, it was like a 10.51% increase. So far it looks like our tuition increases have not slowed down, and in fact, it's possible that they're even going up even faster. Any questions or thoughts on that?
I have a question. Under the Oregon University system, like, was there a body that set tuition, and when did it set it like a tuition rate across the state or based on each campus? Or like, who was setting tuition? I guess?
Yeah, there was an oversight body, and it was like, yeah, the Oregon University system like had like a state board of higher education and a chancellor who was kind of like the primary agent or executive of that board, and they had oversight over tuition. I don't believe that it was one tuition rate across the state, but it basically, my understanding is that every institution was coming to that board for approval of their like budget and tuition.
Okay.
And that kind of brings us to Oregon Student Association and how that organizing played in, because Oregon Student Association in the 5 years since then has really been having to work on reevaluating how we do our organizing and advocacy, because before we kind of had one primary target, right? That was the State Board of Higher Education through the Oregon University system. And with the dismantling of that, we have all these targets, right? We have the Board of Trustees, we have the state legislature, we have the HEC. So it's just become a more fragmented and complicated landscape in terms of decision making, advocacy, and organizing for students to navigate.
Thank you, Andrew. I know we threw a lot at you, but here's to summing it all up. Access to post-secondary education is crucial for all Oregonians in order to achieve financial autonomy and upward social mobility for its students. Decades of tax cuts for the wealthy, as we had mentioned previously, and corporations have decreased state resources and shifted the burden of public post-secondary education to us, the students, through tuition dollars. This problem disproportionately impacts students from marginalized communities. Over the decade, our post-secondary education system has become more reliant on private funding models, while students continue to face tuition increases. With the state of Oregon's revenue deeply dependent on the income of Oregonians, an inaccessible education diminishes the earning potentials of Oregonians, further diminishing the state income to put towards education funding and thus making the problem even worse.
Awesome. Thank you both. So, what now? We have gone through probably a lot of very frustrating, disheartening, not so fun things. And we're going to have a Q&A, and I'm really excited to hear the engagement from all the attendees today. But I just want to take a minute to say what's next. And I think that the important thing is to look at these teach-ins as an opportunity for good education moments, but also mobilization moments. And so bring a few friends to the next webinar on food and housing insecurity, as well as the history of the student movement. That's going to be week 8. We really want to try to get as many people to come as possible, because I think that it's not a day-to-day shared knowledge that the privatization of education is something that's full throttle in the state of Oregon. And I hope that, this has been illuminating, and we want to continue that. Also, we're going to try to, spice up the content with some coalition partners to potentially come on, as well as a panel, but there will be more info as we finalize those logistics later. Also, next year is a long legislative session. And so that means that Oregon's going to be setting the budget. And it's really important for us to stay engaged and make sure that we're looking at what's happening in the Capitol, because we are most likely facing really huge budget cuts. And we need to make sure that students are at the table and being prioritized, so that we don't see a continued crisis expand for students on college campuses. And so our planning will begin this summer, and we really hope that you all will want to take part with us on that. And the organizing will begin in fall. And so for the take part with us, for updates when our meetings are happening and the events, drop your email and name in the chat right now and say, "I'm in." Woo, great. And while y'all are dropping that in there, also finally help us fight for protecting student renters right now. And so if you also want to work on the crisis that students are facing with rent protections, and specifically the unique situation that students are faced with right now, where a lot of students have moved and are currently not staying at the lease that they were planning on staying for the rest of the academic year, we really want to advocate to make sure that the governor extends the executive order to those students so that they can break their lease without any additional costs. And so if you would also like that email template so that you can advocate for renters, type in renters into the chat to get that email template.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. And while we're dropping that, I think we just want to open it up to Q&A and just discussion about it. So feel free to kind of raise your hand. And I see one question now, and I'll keep unmuting folks so that we can get into things. I saw a question from E.
Yeah, so I'm thanks for the presentation. I'm really curious, do you have examples of states or systems where they kept that public model and they kept the kind of oversight, central oversight that shows either decrease or leveling of tuition? I'm trying to figure out, like, is the increase just because of the public-private partnership, or are there other things at play? So are there examples of where this didn't happen and we're seeing lower rates of tuition, or is it just kind of like everyone's tuition has gone up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say the answer is complicated, right? So first of all, I definitely don't think that the kind of public-private partnership model is the only reason we've seen tuition increases. There are definitely other states that did keep their statewide systems. I would say California, Minnesota, and Washington are good ones to look at, as well as Michigan. And really it's kind of hard to do an apples to apples comparison. So in preparing for this, kind of looking around, and I can follow up with some like good resources that I was looking at. I wouldn't say that there's like kind of like, it's not like you could make one chart and say like, this is how regulated a statewide and strong a statewide system is to how unregulated it is, and there's an exact correlation, right? There's kind of a lot of factors driving enrollment trends, funding per student, just state income, and like how much taxes corporations are paying, how much taxes individuals are paying, the median wealth of individuals. So it's definitely kind of like there's multiple factors. So it's hard to do a great comparison. I'd say one example of a big win in terms of good things happening are kind of the statewide promise programs we're starting to see. And there is one in Oregon, but it only applies to two-year colleges, and is a last dollar in program, which means it doesn't necessarily help a lot of low income individuals with total cost of education. But Washington just passed a huge financial aid package, and kind of a big promise program, and also like the New York system has a good one. So those are some places I would start. I'm sorry to not have like a more like clean cut answer for you, but there's just like a lot of factors. Victor or Gabby, would you add anything to that? Cool. Thanks for that question. Any other questions or thoughts from folks?
I have a few questions. So right now, like whenever we're talking about the disinvestment in higher education, people really focus on like the funding from the state, like the lack of funding from the state as being like a big issue, which it is a big issue. And like the reason that funding isn't there is because of like our tax structures. And like there has been a lot of conversations about like reforming our corporate like tax structure, but there hasn't, like I haven't seen as much conversation about reforming like property tax structure. Like what have you heard about that? Like what are the implications of that? I guess I don't know. And you may not have the answers, but I'm just curious. That was like one thing I was thinking about throughout this.
Yeah, that's a great question and a good thing to look into. I do know that there have been discussions and attempts to address our property tax structure over the years. I don't have like specific info on it, but I can follow up with that and look into it. And I also just know generally like they have not been super successful, right? We haven't like seen a big shift back from ballot measure 5. And I think one example of that is that in the last long legislative session, the Student Success Act was passed, which was a revenue package dedicated through K through 12 funding. So in a lot of ways, I think kind of we've looked at a more statewide level rather than towards like a more like local property tax level since then. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for that question.
And then my next question is like, I personally like think privatization is a bad trend, and like I'm really not like very favorable of the current system that higher education like operates under in Oregon. And I think like that the previous system was much more more appropriate when we're talking about like public education. So like what kind of work has been done, or has there work been done by OSA or others to like backtrack a little bit or to democratize the board of trustees so it's less like corporate interests? Like, is there any work around that being done?
Yeah. So first of all, on both the Higher Education Coordinating Commission and on boards of trustees, there is student as well as faculty and classified staff labor representatives on those boards. And that only exists because of the work that OSA and labor did on those things. So it's a small thing, right? I believe at boards of trustees, the student, I think there was a deal cut where the student rep on like the HEC does not get to vote. The student rep on the BOT does get to vote. So that's one thing that was done. Another thing was the Student Voice and Transparency Act that we were able to pass in the 2018 short session. And that actually put into place the idea of tuition and fee advisory boards. And I know at the U of O, actually, that all already to some extent existed. And I think that there's like some concerns that we've heard a lot around those and some flaws around those in terms of the way that that's kind of used to just like push through what the VP of Finance will want to do, and students will feel like their input isn't like super meaningful sometimes. But that is like kind of like one structural thing we've done. And the other thing I'd say is like, just in general, I don't think that this is a major movement or something we're hearing in the Capitol, but we are in the last year or so in the Capitol starting to hear legislators look back and question and say, we feel like we haven't seen better outcomes for affordability of higher education, and we did this whole statewide restructure, and what's going on here? So like there are legislators who I would say are starting to question whether what was done in 2015 or really 2013 and implemented in 2015 has had the outcomes that they were expecting based on the talking points.
And I want to add a little bit to that too. So one other thing that I know that we've managed to implement for at least universities is the 5% tuition cap, which is also another thing that was really important work that we did to make sure that that was in place. That still leaves out community colleges, which is also a really important conversation, because I don't think the conversation of community college tuition increasing over 5% made a lot of sense. But as we're seeing, there have been really substantial community college rate increases as well. But I think that when Senate Bill 270, and that's the bill that created the institutional boards, you all can look up, it had a lot of bipartisan support. So it was very popular. But I would echo that when the 2019 public university funding system, the PUSF, I think, was passed, there was a budget note on transparency that Andrew was talking about in terms of legislators looking at the fact that these like really big capital construction projects are happening, but students are continually saying that there is issues in terms of affordability and access. And so I really also think it's important to keep that in mind as an important vantage, like access and vantage point to the Capitol, to have those conversations about, you know, what's going to make sense, what's going to be a better system for students to make sure that they're represented, and not being used as like the constant balancer of the budget, and to find better sources of revenue for the colleges.
Nice, thank you all for that. Yeah, I mean, I bring it up because I know that like, so I have heard that from legislators as well, that it's like, it's not working out ideally as they wanted it like to, like they figure that they would be bringing in all this private money for the university, but like as y'all said in the presentation, like a lot of it doesn't go towards the general fund, which addresses tuition. So like it's not like working out how they want it to, and that's just like leaving a lot of people frustrated. And like the reason I'm mostly bringing it up is because on the UO campus there's like that group, the group of students that I work with them, but they're also just, there's like a lot of students working in it. It's like Reclaim UO, and their main goal is to democratize the board of trustees, because they see like that the current structure of it, of how like the board of trustees comes about, is really problematic, with Schill just recommending things to the governor and the governor appointing. And now at UO, like our whole board is, we have members from like Goldman Sachs, we have people from Columbia Sportswear, we have Chuck Lillis from that big multimedia company, we have people from Microsoft, etc. And like their like tendency towards privatization and their corporate mindsets like are always displayed in their decisions. Like when we see tuition going up every single year, and when we see moves on campus towards privatization, and when we see fighting of contracts for GEs and faculty and staff, and like at the U, I think like what this group has come to the determination of is that like it all roots back to this board structure. And like, so their main goal is to democratize the board of trustees. So yeah, I'm just like, I just want to put that out there for anyone that's still here to hear that that is a thing, and that it like can't, like you can start having these kind of conversations on your campus as well, and we can all connect. And I like, for me personally, I think the direction we should be moving in is towards democratizing those boards and getting something that looks closer to like our old system. I just wanted to put that out there. Sorry, I just talked so much.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that out there, Nick. I think Marilyn had a question also.
Yeah, I think kind of the main thing I was thinking about during a lot of it was kind of how a lot of the federal discussion, and I think also it sounds like the kind of local state decisions and movements towards privatization also kind of create the issue of, I know there's a lot of kind of funneling and marketing towards low income and first generation folks to kind of get involved with for-profit colleges a lot as well. And there's, you know, always a discussion of, oh, it's super quick and super easy to get involved with these colleges. I think it's interesting to think how kind of, you know, the funding going down and kind of the ability to market and ability to reach those people in the community through community colleges, you know, creates kind of a shift towards even institutional type and what kind of we're valuing through that. This system kind of creates issues with that. So a lot of interesting things I feel like to think through with that, and creates a lot of ethical issues.
Thanks for that. Yeah.
Sorry, was about someone about to talk? Okay, I was just gonna ask, like, y'all mentioned like that you're gonna start like working towards the long legislative session. Like, what do y'all think OSA's priorities are for that long legislative session?
You know, we kind of like go through a process with our student leaders of kind of solidifying priorities, right? But I mean, I would say that something we do always work on in general is affordability and accessibility of education. And so, you know, definitely in every long legislative session, really looking at protecting funding for financial aid programs, and when we can, expanding it. But I think that something really unique about this upcoming session is with the unemployment rate, what it is, we're actually in a moment where people in Oregon are going to be more dependent on social safety nets, and yet the state of Oregon is going to have less money, and that means they're going to be looking at budget cuts. And so we have a really important year coming up where we're going to need to be fighting to protect against even deeper cuts to our financial aid programs and our funding for higher education.
So given COVID and everything, do you think like it sounds like really the main focus is going to be like just securing that funding? Because like, I don't know, I'm starting to think like if you're, I don't know what I'm thinking. I just like, I could see where if you were like spending capacity and energy pushing in other areas that you could jeopardize that funding, which would be really problematic. So I could see why that would need to be the number one focus given everything that's going on and how budgets are going to be much tighter.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that. And I see Malin has a hand up and E has a hand up. I think I'll unmute you, Malin, and then E, I'll get to you next.
Yeah, so I'll just say kind of what I said in the chat here. So I was just going to say, I'm curious of all kind of the ramifications of the staff being furloughed, as it will kind of diminish the abilities of departments to really be able to work to help students find a sense of belonging. And I think, especially on the community college level, I'm curious, you know, with this reliance on kind of privatization and funding and donors, how that's going to shift. Because I know we've talked about, like, I had a class just specifically on community colleges, and there was kind of a discussion of the difficulties in fundraising programs through community colleges and being able to get that community engagement. So that'll be kind of interesting to see how that continues to shift as COVID-19 progresses.
Totally. And then I see E with a hand up too. So E, I'll get you unmuted. Sorry, there you go.
Cool.
E.
So yeah, it seems like maybe you have a little bit better understanding of just how tax systems work in Oregon. So you may not have an answer to this, but you may. And I've just been trying to figure out, with so many folks on unemployment right now, and I know that even if you're on unemployment, there's still taxes that are taken out, I think with the exception of Medicare and Social Security. How are those taxes different, and how could they impact the bottom line for Oregon, since we're so based on employment tax, especially because I'm thinking about the extra $600 a week from the feds. Like, is that money taxed as well? I'm just curious about, maybe if you can share a little bit about how those things work.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's definitely, the tax system is complicated. To my understanding, the stimulus check that people are being provided with are not going to be taxed. Don't quote me on that, but that is like my understanding of it at the moment. In terms of just how it is, you know, like how much of a buffer there is with the fact that there might still be income taxes on unemployment benefits, I'd say, well, I'm not the best person to give you like a super detailed explanation of this. Like, I would just kind of bring up like a few things. Like, first of all, when people are on unemployment benefits, sometimes they're not necessarily like making as much as they would be if they were employed with a job, right? And there's a lot of factors in that, in terms of like what benefits they're given for how long. There's also in terms of like what hours are you working, and like what hours were you working. So overall, you know, kind of at the end of the day, what I do know is that the state is forecasting losing a huge amount of tax revenue and is looking at deep cuts. And in terms of the apparatus of how that plays out, that's a really great question, but I don't have like super detailed like understanding of all that, so I wouldn't want to give you any wrong information. Thanks for those questions, folks. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions?
I can also go back to any slides if anybody wants me to.
Are we able to get the link as well of the PowerPoint to kind of look back at?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
I just want to say thank you all so much. That was really like a really big picture, like explanation that was really like helped me see like the history and how it's had the impacts over time and how that's resulted in where we're at today. I'm aware of a lot of this stuff, but the way y'all connected it was really effective for me, and I just really appreciate y'all offering this resource. And we got to get more students in these because they're so incredible. So thank y'all for taking the time to do this, and it means a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one thing I also just want to highlight for the training before sounds like folks are wrapping up with thoughts and questions is the importance of access and education as well. Because as we saw going through some of the first slides, I think especially when budget conversations are happening on community colleges and universities, oftentimes the programs that are first on the chopping block in those discussions is things like, Centers for Multicultural Academic Excellence and like other really important programs for low-income students. Things like I know the Pathway program for low-income students was also something that was always first on the chopping block. And as we could see, some of the importance of making sure that our colleges have healthy and sustainable enrollment, it's also really important to look at those budget cuts that we're going to be facing in the next legislative session and having really important and intentional conversations about the accountability of where funds go, because if we just go based off of the short term, what's cost negative and what's cost positive, we've seen the long-term implications of Oregon institutions not focusing on that. So I think that's also a really important highlight. And if anybody else has anything else, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gabby. And I did see a question in the chat. Is there education funding from the Oregon Lottery? That's a great question. Thanks for that. So yeah, there is. The Oregon Lottery Fund is actually like one of the biggest sources of revenue and therefore of funding for state programs in the state. And so I think, to some extent, definitely dollars for that from that do go to things like the Oregon Opportunity Grant, and I believe to like other items of education as well. Well, thanks everyone. Any other last thoughts or questions to throw in the chat? Yeah, absolutely. Our pleasure to do this. And once again, we're having another one at the same time next week. And we're going to be talking about kind of like total cost of education, right? So we're going to talk about food and housing insecurity, textbook affordability, and try to rebuild off this and talk about that. And we also might have some folks from Partners for a Hunger Free Oregon join us. So that should be really good too. So hope you come back, and thanks for coming to this one. Victor, do you have any closing thoughts for us or remarks?
Not much other than like I share that same sentiment with Nick in regard to like how this information really puts things into perspective, especially for the long session next year. So definitely bringing this to the attention of our legislators and being like just being aware of like all that's going on and why it's happening. But thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. Definitely reach out if you want to get involved in any way.
Thanks all. Have great weekends. Bye.